Hello, students. Let us now turn our attention to the major school of literary criticism known as New Criticism. We have already discussed Russian formalism and schools of British criticism like the practical criticism of I. Richards. We discussed that both of these were rather scientific ways of practicing literary criticism and which gave a lot of importance to the text more than anything else and insisted on the formal features of literature, the language, the figures of speech, the images, and so on. So it is exactly that kind of formalism that we are talking about when we discuss new criticism. The only difference is that new criticism is an American school of literary criticism. So you have the Russian formalism, British practical criticism, and American new criticism. All of these are different kinds of formalist ways of literary criticism. All these schools, in their own ways, gave importance to the formal features of literature. So, a new criticism is a school of American literary criticism. It was particularly prominent in the post First World War era, and it was the most influential school of literary criticism in the United States during the middle of the 20th century. It was a formalist movement that insisted on close textual reading, and it upheld the intrinsic value of a work of art. That is, it considered that the value of a work of art is within itself. Its value does not lie outside. It does not lie in the life of the author or the society in which that author lived. None of these external situations matter to new criticism. They upheld the intrinsic value of a work of art and focused attention on the individual work alone. They considered the literary work as an independent, self-contained unit of meaning. You do not need to look elsewhere for the meaning or the value of a literary work. So they opposed other schools of literary criticism and other critical practices that gave importance to social, political, historical, or biographical features. There were many schools that gave importance to these features, these aspects, and they considered these backgrounds to be of great significance when it came to analyzing the text. But the new critics were opposed to all those. New criticism was the predominant method of teaching literature in American universities in the 20th century. Now, why was it called new criticism? It was called new criticism mainly because it was so different from any school of literary criticism that was prevalent till then. So it had something very unique, something very radical, something very different to offer. And that was why it was called new criticism. Actually, the term became more popular with the publication of a book by one of the major members of the school of new literary criticism. We'll come to that soon. The major influences that shaped the origin of new criticism would include Russian formalism to begin with. the Russian formalist, particularly Roman Jakobson, was in many ways very uh, influential in the emergence of new criticism. We remember how Roman Jakobson had to flee Russia with the arrival of Stalin on in power in Russia, and he moved to Prague in Czechoslovakia. That is where he founded the Prague Linguistic Circle. But then from there he migrated to the United States, and along with other critics, he influenced the young scholars of those times, and that is how you have the emergence of new criticism in America. So apart from Russian formalism, we also, of course, remember the powerful influence wielded by I. Richards, the British critic whose concept of practical criticism, the very scientific kind of practical criticism, and the distinction that he made between the denotative and the connotative meanings of words, the the direct and the referential meanings of words, and so on. These were also very significant. So also T.S. Eliot as a critic who gave a lot of importance to a close reading of the text. You can think of, some of the essays of T.S. Eliot, which engaged in close readings of literary texts. Another major British critic whose influence again was very powerful on new criticism is William Emerson. William Emerson and his concept of ambiguity. Ambiguity is nothing but words having different and often contradictory meanings. The attention that he gave to these kind of multiple meanings in words, in poetry, that again was very significant, and that was something which influenced the new critics. So these were the major influences that shaped the development of new criticism. So what is new criticism? Of course, we know that it was a new way of analyzing literary texts. It was popular during the middle of the 20th century, and the new critics, so many of them, they upheld a few important concepts and ideas. Of course, when you look at it comprehensively, you can state that new criticism was a very scientific approach. And since it did not give too much importance to the social, political, or the historical context of a literary work, you may call it an unhistorical approach. So it was a scientific approach and not to a historical. It is rather unhistorical. And it isolated a work from its origins and context. That is, it separated the work from the background. The work is important, the background is not so important. The society or the author or the readers, none of these are as important as the work itself. And they were also influenced by the French practice of explication de texte, that is nothing but a close reading of the text. And they gave a lot of importance to the connotative and associative values of words and figurative language, that is not so much the denotative meaning. The denotative meaning is of course there. A word means something. A word like a tree means a tree, the real tree that we are familiar with. But it connotes something else. It has other associations. It is a figurative word. And they gave a lot of importance to those extra unseen meanings of words. They were very much excited about the complexity of a work. They never considered a work as a very simple, one-sided entity. They were very mumuch interested in looking at the complexity of anything, of any literary work. And they believed that this complexity, this multi-faceted nature of literary work is a result of a lot of things, multiple meanings, which are mainly produced by literary devices used by the author, like paradox, irony, ambiguity, tension, and so on. These are some significant terms associated with new criticism. We'll discuss that during this session. And new criticism also rejected the practice of paraphrasing in literary studies. What is paraphrasing? Looking for the meaning, finding out or explaining the meaning of something, explaining a text, saying that it has this or that as the meaning. And this is something that the new critics rejected. They believed that a text cannot be reduced to its meaning. അതിൻ്റെ മീനിങ് അല്ല, അതിൽ അടങ്ങിയിട്ടുള്ള മറ്റു കാര്യങ്ങൾ, the language, the style, the features, the images, the metaphors, and other literary devices. These are more important than the meaning. And reducing a work to its meaning is a very absurd thing, according to the new critics. Heresy of paraphrase. We'll explain that term. They believe that a work should not be belittled. It should not be insulted by just interpreting its meaning. It is much more than its meaning. The new critics in general preferred poetry. Poetry was what they often used for their literary analyses. They privileged poetry over other forms of literary expression because they believed that the poem was actually the purest exemplification of the literary values that they upheld. The figures of speech like irony, ambiguity, tension, paradox, these are best seen in poetry. But, they did not reject other literary genres, even those, whether it is a play or a novel or anything for that, any other genre. All of these can be subjected to close reading. You can make structural analyses of fiction, drama, and other literary forms. They were not so much bothered about the distinction between one literary genre and another, whether it is a poem or a novel or a play. What is important in it is the literary devices, the forms, and not so much the genre. So the essential components of any work of literature, according to them, whether lyric or narrative or dramatic, are the words, the images, the metaphors, and so on, and not so much character, thought, plot, and so on. Okay? They are not concerned about such things. They're not so much concerned about the character of Hamlet. We talk about procrastination being his tragic flaw and the complexity of his relationship with his mother and so on. That's not what is of great significance to the new critics. They would, on the other hand, look at the lines uttered by Hamlet, the kind of language that is used, the figures of speech used by him, the beauty of a line like to be or not to be. It's a very, very paradoxical statement, to be or not to be. And in the paradox of that statement, you have the greatest depth of meaning. And that is what they were interested in. So let us now see who the major critics are who make up the school known as New Criticism. I think even though John Crowe Ransom is probably not the best known among the new critics, we must remember him as a significant critic because it was his book, The New Criticism, first published in 1941, which was in fact a kind of assessment of the critical practice of British critics like I. Richards, T.S. Eliot, and William Emerson, and of course the American critic Eva Winters. This book, The New Criticism, published in 1941, was in many ways responsible for giving New Criticism its title or its name. So that is John Crowe Ransom, a major new critic. Then we come to the two major figures, Glen Brooks and Robert Penn Warren. Glen Brooks particularly may be probably considered as the best known among the new critics. The two of them together wrote this work called Understanding Poetry. Of course, this is only one of their works. Each one of them individually went on to write many more books. But this is one work, where you can see very good examples of close readings of poems. So this is the combined work of Glen Brooks and Robert Penn Warren. And then we have two other significant figures, William K. Wimsatt and Monroe C. Beardsley. Again, some of the important tenets of new criticism came from these two critics, William K. Wimsatt and Monroe C. Beardsley. Alan Tate and R.P. Blackmore. They were again two major critics. Alan Tate, especially, the one who propounded the theory of tension as an important element of poetry. So that is Alan Tate and R.P. Blackmore. Let us now take a look at the important principles or the tenets of new criticism. What is it that makes new criticism new, or what is it that makes new criticism significant and different from other schools of literary criticism? I think the first important point that we need to highlight is the principle of explication. In other words, close reading. Close reading was something that each one of the new critics insisted on doing. Close reading refers to a close textual analysis, close look at the text, rather than getting diverted by things outside the text. These critics insisted that we need to turn our gaze textward into the text. So that is how we can conclude that the primary technique employed by the new critics is explication or close reading of the text. They consider the text as an autotelic artifact, an autotelic thing. What does that mean? It is complete in itself and it exists for its own sake. It is a self-defined, self-contained unit. You do not have to look outside it for its meaning, autotelic. And they believed that the proper concern of any literary critic should not be with the external circumstances or the effects or the historical or the political position of a work, but the critic must be fully engaged with a detailed consideration of the work itself. They did not want the literary critic to waste his or her time by looking at things outside the text. So that is how explication becomes the most important feature of new criticism. New criticism then is intrinsic. That is, it pays it is, this practice of literary criticism is one which exists within the confines of the text, and within the text it gives importance to words, the theme, okay, then not the meaning or the value of a literary work, but the theme, the words, the theme, the imagery, the metaphor, the rhythm, the meter, and so on. So these critics would examine very closely the formal elements that make the work of art unique, that give significance to that particular any work of art. So new criticism is intrinsic. It exists within the confines or the limits of the text. Heresy of paraphrase. Now this is an important term or phrase that is associated with new criticism, and it was none other than Glen Brooks, the major new critic, who came up with this phrase, heresy of paraphrase. He used this in his well-known book, The Well-Wrought Urn. The Well-Wrought Urn is an important book of new criticism written by Glen Brooks, and it is in this work that he talks about the heresy of paraphrase. What is heresy? A heresy is a very uh, absurd, foolish, mad thing to do. He asserted that the meaning of a poem is very, very complex, and you cannot ever reduce it to a single meaning. If you do that, you are distorting the work. You are destroying and doing injustice to the work. And therefore, any attempt to try to say what a poem means is heretical. It is a mad exercise. It is an insult to the integrity of the complex structure of meanings within the work. So a work can never be reduced to a single meaning. That is why he said it is heretical or madness or silly and absurd and meaningless to look for meaning, single meanings in works of art. Heresy of paraphrase. So Glen Brooks was a key figure in new criticism, and he can without any exaggeration be said to have revolutionized the teaching of poetry in America. That is, he gave it a new orientation altogether. He was, of course, majorly influenced by T.S. Eliot, I. Richards, William Emerson, and also F.R. Lewis. And he always insisted on the interior life of a poem. And he was somebody who codified, he was one among the first to codify the principles of close reading. Some of his best known works are The Well-Wrought Urn, Modern Poetry and the Tradition, and so on. And in these works, he argues for the centrality of ambiguity and paradox as a way of understanding poetry. That is, there is a lot of ambiguity in literature, there is a lot of paradox in literature. These are all figures of speech and literary devices which make a text multifaceted. Ambiguity means the existence of multiple meanings for a particular word or a particular text. Ambiguity, the inability to reduce anything to one single meaning. That is ambiguity. We'll talk in detail about ambiguity, but before, yes, paradox. Paradox is a literary device which consists of the juxtaposition, the placing side by side of incongruous ideas, ideas that we normally do not place together. Like, for example, black and white. These are two contrary things, which when placed together would create a very interesting situation. It is, much more interesting than placing black and black together or white and white. There is nothing new about it. But when you place two incongruous, two surprising, two strange things together, that can be considered as paradox. You have plenty of examples of paradox that he highlights in his analyses of literary works, in the essays that he wrote, interpreting or analyzing literary works. Yes, so this juxtaposition, placing side by side of these strange, incongruous ideas, create a kind of striking exposition of unexpected insight. You get a very new, novel, unexpected insight into a work when you have these contrary ideas being placed together. So he stated that through the use of ironic contrast and ambivalence, the poet is able to create internal paradoxes which are always resolved. So you have a lot of ambivalence. You have things that you do not expect to come together. So there is a lot of ambivalence, and that creates this internal paradox. And by focusing and giving a lot of attention to that paradox, by reflecting over it, by trying to interpret its various meanings, connotations, and so on, you can derive, you can, get a taste of the beauty of that literary work. So he considers paradox to be the most important language and literary convention in poetry. To quote him, he says, paradox is the language appropriate and inheritable to poetry. Without paradox, there is no poetry, was his stand. And he, of course, quotes profusely from writers like Wordsworth and others. But the most famous example of paradox that he cites probably is in his reading of the poem The Canonization by John Donne. And he says the very poem, The Canonization, rests on a paradox. What is that? He uses this image of canonization. I hope you're familiar with the poem. If not, I would I would exhort you to read the poem, John Donne's famous metaphysical poem, The Canonization. What you have there is the comparison of two lovers. You have the speaker and his beloved. The two lovers are being compared to saints. Canonization is a very religious term. It is a term that is of great significance in Christianity. You have the saints, when somebody is elevated to the status of a saint, that process is what is known as canonization. We know that it is the Pope who has the power to canonize somebody. We are familiar with the canonization of Mother Teresa. It is after that she is known as Saint Teresa. So ordinary human beings, because of their special life, because of some miracles that they have performed and so on, they are elevated by the church to the position of saints. Saints are venerated by others. You pray to a saint, Saint Alphonsama, Saint Euphrasia, Saint Teresa. These are all, examples of canonized people. And canonization, how does he use the image of canonization here? Here, the lovers are being compared to saints. They are the ones who get canonization. So look at the paradox. A term like canonization, which is a very religious term, is used to describe a very physical or worldly thing, the love between two lovers, two human beings. They are worldly lovers. വളരെ ലൗകികമായിട്ടുള്ള ഒരു കാര്യത്തെ ഡിസ്ക്രൈബ് ചെയ്യാൻ ആയിട്ട് ഉപയോഗിക്കുന്നത് വളരെ ദൈവികമായിട്ടുള്ള ഒരു കാര്യം. സോ religious term is used to describe or to add color to the physical relationship. So it is that is what makes it paradoxical. He argues that by rejecting the material world, the two lovers spend their time together. They forget about everything else. ലോകത്തെ മുഴുവൻ മറന്നിട്ട് they live in each other's world. They withdraw to a world of each other. അവർ മാത്രം ഉള്ള ഒരു ലോകം. അവിടെയാണ് they become like saints. Because what does a saint do? A saint also renounces the world and enters a different world altogether. And these lovers, they renounce the outside world and enter a world for themselves. And therefore, the poet says that they are like saints who can be canonized, or they can be canonized and be treated as saints. So that is a supreme example of paradox. That is what makes the poem so unique. Okay, so that is about paradox. Now, closely allied to paradox is irony, another figure of speech, which is a kind of understatement. Irony is when you say something and you suggest something else. When your exam was very difficult, a paper that you and then you say, oh, it was so easy. That's an ironic statement. Think of the employment of such ironic statements in poetry. When you say something, it means something. It seems to convey something, but you know that beneath that is hidden something very strange, something mysterious, something that is not obviously visible. That depth, ആ ഒരു ആഴം ആണ് poetryക്ക് ഭംഗി കൂട്ടുന്നത്. That depth is what adds beauty and uniqueness to a poem. So irony is a new way, a novel way of saying something. It's a new way of expression. When we discussed Russian formalism, we talked about defamiliarization. That is a new way, a way that is different from the ordinary. സാധാരണ പറയുന്ന രീതിയിൽ നിന്ന് വ്യത്യസ്തമായ ഒരു രീതിയിൽ പറയാം. That is what literature is, and that is what irony does to a statement. When you say things in an ironic manner, you are saying things in a very fresh manner. It's a kind of special strategy that a poet can use to bring in freshness, originality, newness, charm into poetry. So irony, like paradox, is an important aspect of literature, according to these new critics. Yeah, the next important phrase that we associate with new criticism is intentional and effective fallacy. Fallacies, two kinds of fallacies: intentional fallacy and effective fallacy. What is a fallacy? A fallacy is nothing but an error, a mistake, and they consider that they believe that there are two kinds of mistakes that critics often make. And the new critics, William K. Wimsatt and Monroe Beardsley, they were the ones who actually spoke about intentional fallacy and effective fallacy. In diverting or in directing all their attention to the poem itself, these new critics rejected the personal input or intention of the writer. When you take up a work of art, you need not be, or you should not be bothered about what the writer intended. ആ ഒരു കാര്യം നോക്കുന്നത്, റൈറ്ററിന്റെ ഉദ്ദേശം എന്താണോ എന്ന് നോക്കുന്നത് ഒരു ഫാലസിയാണ്, ഒരു എറർ. It is a mistake. That is something that you should not do. Why are you bothered about what the writer may have intended? That is not your concern. You should more, on the other hand, look at the work itself and what makes the work unique. The writer's intention is not significant. In a similar manner, the effect that the work has on the reader, the way the reader is affected, അതും നമ്മൾ നോക്കേണ്ട കാര്യമില്ല. That is also not a significant thing. To look at the effect, the way the reader is affected, is again a mistake. It is an error. It is a fallacy. Yeah, so these are two fallacies that we encounter in the study of literature. So intentional fallacy is the mistake of looking for the author's intention, and such an approach is fallacious or wrong. It's a mistake because the work is contained within itself. You need not look at the author's intention. Similarly, looking at the emotional effect that a work has upon its audience or its readers is also a mistake. That is what is called effective fallacy. A text should never be understood in relation to the responses of its readers. So the design or intention of the author and the impact on the reader or the audience are neither available nor desirable as standards for judging a literary work. This is what the new critics upheld. So that is intentional fallacy and effective fallacy. When we discuss new criticism, we cannot avoid the discussion on ambiguity. Ambiguity, of course, is a term that was discussed in great detail by a British critic. New criticism in the പറഞ്ഞാൽ അതൊരു American school of literary criticism ആണ്. But we know that some of the major influences on new criticism were British critics like I. Richards and William Empson and T.S. Eliot, of course. Now, William Empson in one of his important books called 7 Types of Ambiguity, he directed our attention to the meanings, the 7 kinds of ambiguity that you may encounter in literary works. What is ambiguity? Nothing but the uh, tendency of a work to carry multiple meanings. And he analyzes literary works and says that there are 7 situations where you may encounter ambiguity. So he believed that the reader's understanding of a poem will be much enhanced. നമ്മൾക്കൊരു poem കൂടുതൽ നല്ല രീതിയിൽ മനസ്സിലാക്കാൻ പറ്റും when you isolate, when you take a close look at the linguistic properties of that text. He suggested that words and their references are often ambiguous. They may have different meanings, multiple meanings. ഒന്നല്ല ഇതല്ല അതല്ല, it could be this, it could be that also. അങ്ങനെയുള്ള ambiguity, double meanings. And these multiple meanings can enrich the reader's appreciation of the work. So he argued that the complexities of cognitive and tonal meanings in poetry form the basis of the reader's emotional response. So that is what is explained in the next slide. So he went on to talk in detail about the different situations where ambiguity arises. The first type, ambiguity, arises when a detail is effective in several ways at once. A single phenomenon being open to different kinds of interpretation. In second type ambiguities, 2 or more alternative meanings are fully resolved into one. Then the third one is where 2 apparently unconnected meanings are given simultaneously. In the fourth type, the alternative meanings combine to make clear a complicated state of mind. The fifth type is a kind of fortunate confusion when the author is discovering his idea in the act of writing or not holding it in mind all at once. In the sixth type, what is said is contradictory or irrelevant and the reader is forced to invent interpretations. In the seventh type, you have a lot of contradictions. So, these are different, you need not study these different kinds of ambiguities. Just understand that William Empson highlighted different situations, at least 7 situations where you can find ambiguity. Either literary work, look at those situations. Look at the situation where one word has many meanings, where many meanings are conveyed through one image, where you have a lot of contradictions, where you have irrelevant things, where you have ironic things being stated, and so on. So different situations where you may encounter ambiguity. And then one of the last points that we could mention is the concept of tension. Tension was a concept that was made popular by Alan Tate, one of the new critics. ഓരോ ക്രിറ്റിക്കും ഓരോ കോൺസെപ്റ്റാണ് highlight ചെയ്തത്. One may say that, paradox and irony, these were the things that Glen Brooks mainly focused on. Intentional fallacy and effective fallacy, highlighted by William K. Wimsatt and of course Monroe Beardsley. Then we became familiar with the heresy of paraphrase, that is again Glen Brooks. Ambiguity, William Empson. Similarly, tension. Tension was the linguistic feature that Alan Tate highlighted. Glen Brooks എങ്ങനെ പാരഡോക്സിനെ inevitable language of poetry എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞു. In a similar manner, Alan Tate believed that tension is what gives beauty to poetry. And what is tension? Tension is nothing but the pull between the denotative and the connotative meaning of a word. A word means something, but it may also suggest something else. അപ്പോൾ അങ്ങനെയുള്ള denotative meaning, it denotes something, it stands for something, അതിൻ്റെ direct meaning. പക്ഷെ അതിൻ്റെ പിന്നിൽ ഒളിച്ചിരിക്കുന്ന connotative meaning, ഇത് തമ്മിലുള്ള tension, that is what gives beauty to any literary work. He arrived at this word tension by removing the prefixes in and ex from words like intention and extension. Intention, author's intention ആവശ്യമില്ല, ആ in എടുത്ത് കളയും. extension going out to the audience or the readers, adum avashyamilla. Take away that X. What are you left with? Tension. So extension refers to what he meant by extension is the logical or the denotative meaning of poetry. Extension എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ what a word means directly. Intention, on the other hand, means the intensive or the connotative meaning of poetry. And according to him, both will be there in any work of art. The tension between them, അത് തമ്മിലുള്ള ഒരു the pull between the the direct meaning and the suggested meaning. That is, a successful poem is one in which these two meanings are in a state of tension. അങ്ങോട്ടും ഇങ്ങോട്ടും വലിയുന്ന രീതിയിൽ. So the pull of both will be very strong. അതിൻ്റെ ഒരു ഡയറക്റ്റ് മീനിങ് ഇത്, അത് സജസ്റ്റ് ചെയ്യുന്ന മീനിങ് മറ്റൊന്ന്. സോ ദാറ്റ് ടെൻഷൻ, ദാറ്റ് സ്ട്രെങ്ത്, അത് തമ്മിലുള്ള വലിഞ്ഞു നിൽക്കുന്ന ആ ഒരു സിറ്റുവേഷൻ, ദാറ്റ് ഇസ് വാട്ട് ഗിവ്സ് സ്ട്രെങ്ത് ആൻഡ് ബ്യൂട്ടി ടു എ poem. So just like Glen Brooks, Alan Tate also quotes from John Donne, the metaphysical poet John Donne, and Donne's poem A Valediction Forbidding Mourning, to again give us a beautiful example of tension. And this is in the use of gold as an image by in the poem. Here the poet compares the souls of the lovers and their unity with the uniqueness of gold. Gold is of course a very precious thing, and so also is their love. But it is very strange to compare a love, the soul, to something that is the spatial. So the soul is a non-spatial thing. You cannot say that the soul occupies any space, whereas gold is a spatial thing. So you have two contradictory things, two heterodox ideas being brought together: the soul of the lovers and gold. But then, and therefore the contradiction comes there. However, that therefore, in that stage, what it is the connotative meaning of gold that is being used. That is, gold is precious. So the soul, even though it is unlike gold because it is a non-spatial thing, അത് ഡിഫറെൻ്റ് ആണ്, ഗോൾഡിൽ നിന്നും ഡിഫറെൻ്റ് ആണ്. പക്ഷേ ഗോൾഡ് ഇസ് പ്രഷ്യസ്. ഗോൾഡിൻ്റെ കൊണോട്ടേറ്റീവ് മീനിങ്, ഗോൾഡിൻ്റെ ഡയറക്റ്റ് മീനിങ് അതൊരു യെല്ലോ മെറ്റൽ, ബട്ട് ദ കൊണോട്ടേറ്റീവ് മീനിങ് ഇസ് something precious, and that is exactly what their love is. It is something unique and precious. But you cannot overlook the denotative meaning of gold. അവിടെ എന്താ denotative meaning? Gold is something that can be, poemil പറയുന്ന ഒരു കാര്യം, it is beat to airy thinness. Gold is, we've studied in school, in our chemistry lessons, that gold is one of the highly malleable and ductile of all elements എന്ന് പറയാറുണ്ട്. That is, it can be drawn into a thin wire and it can be beaten into thin leaves. We lovers തമ്മിലുള്ള distance, that is like the very thin leaf that gold can be beaten into. It's a very micromilligram thin ആയിട്ടുള്ള ഒരു, that is what a gold leaf can be. And similarly, the distance between the two lovers is of micromillimeters. They are so intimate and so close, it is like gold, the very thin leaf-like thinness of gold. So there the denotative meaning is also employed, and it is in these, the play between the connotative and the denotative meaning of gold. Gold as something that is thin or beaten into thin leaves. Adadinte denotative, adinte physical property ana. Whereas its connotative meaning is gold as something that is unique and precious. And both these meanings are employed, are significant in the poem there. And the tension between those two is what gives strength to John Donne's poem. That is what makes the poem so rich and so unique. You cannot reduce it to one single meaning. Both these meanings and beyond that are also um, acceptable there. So this is how new critics generally went about analyzing literary works. ഇവിടെ കണ്ടില്ലേ, we are not even bothered about who John Donne was, what kind of life he lived, what his relationship with his own lady love might have been. We are not bothered about the era in which the poem was written. None of those things matter. We are just looking at the words, the choice of images, and the meanings that are generated, and such, the interpretation is along those lines. So that is what new critics upheld, this kind of close scrutiny or close explication, close reading of the text, and celebrating the multiplicity and the ambiguity of literature. Okay. I'll close this discussion now. I would like you to read the chapter on new criticism in your textbook. And if you have any doubt, I would be very happy to clear your doubts. Okay?